I was telling you how much I really like this principle that people are more important than beliefs. What you're going to be hearing about are issues and cases where people are putting their beliefs above others, and that is putting them above children. Sometimes their own children, sometimes children they actually really love. But in doing so, they're failing to prioritize these individuals and their individual needs. All this religious child maltreatment. Maltreatment is both abuse and neglect. And the first thing I like to do is define it. But before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of background on who I am. I'm a journalist, mostly, although I've done a lot of different things. I run a nonprofit now called the Child Friendly Faith Project. But in 2007 or so, I really started to become alarmed by cases I was reading about in the news where children were being harmed and sometimes even killed due to adherence to extremist religious beliefs, whether they were Christian-based or Muslim-based or Jewish-based. And I started talking to friends of mine who I thought I knew very well, and it turns out that they had some really intense religious backgrounds I wasn't even aware of. And they did not even like to discuss it or think about it much because a lot of it was painful. So the more and more I looked into it, I realized that while there have been memoirs written by people who come from a particular religious background and want to talk about their story, there really wasn't much out there that really looks at what I thought was some important issue. I didn't even know what to call it. When I was thinking, okay, religious child maltreatment makes sense, I thought, well, before I say that, you know, this is what it should be, I should Google it and just see what other people may have said about it if it existed. And child maltreatment in quotes, and I Googled it, and there was only one thing that came up, and it was something I had written. So there was literally very little, I felt, discussion that really looked at the issue as opposed to just, here's what happened to me. So 4 years after that, I wrote this book called Breaking Their Will. I have a few copies here, and anyone who wants one, feel free to take one, either can borrow it or have it. I do ask that people give my nonprofit a donation if you would like to have it, and I appreciate that if you wouldn't mind. And so this really tried to look at the issue as a running theme through many cases, whether it involves sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, neglect. I wanted to really get at what makes a religious environment harmful, because it's not always abusive, it's not always neglectful, if we're looking at how we define abuse and neglect in a clinical way. And I felt that was important, because otherwise you come away with it just saying, well, either all religion's bad, or some people might say all religion is good. And those people have a very hard time thinking that child abuse and neglect can be connected to religion, when in fact it can. Then I started this nonprofit called the Child Friendly Faith Project, and this nonprofit raises awareness of this issue. And at the end of this whole thing, you can see how to contact us if you're interested in getting involved or learning more about it, or emailing me. So as I said, I felt it was important that we get really clear on what we're talking about. What is religious child maltreatment? And I define it as child abuse or neglect that is enabled by religious beliefs held by perpetrators, victims, or the surrounding community. I think you all have seen examples of it and knew that there was something that wasn't quite right about what you were hearing about. But to understand how this kind of thing works, it's important to see how they all tie together. So I'm going to show you a few examples. In the early 2000s, the Boston Globe broke the story of the Catholic Church abuse scandal. And even though that religion is one of many where they don't have child sexual abuse be part of their doctrines, there is still issues where if a perpetrator is a religious authority based on the beliefs that people have about those individuals, about priests and bishops and the Pope, where people won't report child sexual abuse if it's happening, especially if the perpetrator is, as I said, a religious authority. I will say that there are groups, there have been religious organizations where they do promote adult child sex as part of their doctrines, but we don't have time to talk about that now, so I'm going to go to the next one. I think that many of you may be familiar with a passage in Proverbs that talks about withholding the rod and the term that's most quoted is spare the rod and spoil the child. Well, the rod does appear in the Bible, but that quote, spare the rod, spoil the child, does not appear in the Bible. I've had long-running discussions with Christians about this, and finally showed them if you do a search on any of those biblical websites, it will not come up. It comes from a poem written a long time ago by Byron. But anyway, there are adults, based on their belief about Proverbs or other religious doctrines, that they have a right to physically punish their children. And my nonprofit believes that, based on all of the research we've done, that there is no valid reason to use physical pain over and right and wrong. But some of these cases where you have actual physical abuse, where you leave marks on the body and that kind of thing, has been a real problem in some conservative Christian churches, as well as other conservative religious communities. And I believe that probably most have now heard about this horrific case that came out of California, the Turpin family. I won't go into the details of that, but there were 13 children involved, biological children of this couple, and they were extremely abusive and neglectful of their children. That couple will probably spend the rest of their lives in prison because of what they did to these kids. There's a lot of religious influences that were involved in the abuse of those kids. I'm going to skip over religious ritual abuse for a minute, but I'll just quickly say that what we're looking at is something called mitzvah b'peh. It is a Jewish ritual that is done after circumcision. My nonprofit also opposes the genital cutting of children. But what happens here is the moil will suck the wound. And because the vast majority of people have herpes 1, they have passed that on to infants who have become brain damaged and in some cases have died. And then this is one of the most tragic types of religious child maltreatment, where adults who don't believe in medical care for religious reasons but do believe in faith healing will not give their children medical care. So we have many cases of kids who have died of treatable illnesses due to the fact that those who were responsible for them believed that all they had to do was pray in order to cure them. And this teenage girl who grew up in a church in Idaho called the Followers of Christ, she got food poisoning. And because no one took her to the doctor and she was allowed to vomit for days, she ended up dying of a ruptured esophagus. One thing I think that gets passed over a lot is the emotional and psychological issues. And my belief is that whenever you have physical abuse or sexual abuse, you always will have emotional abuse or neglect happening. And there are different kinds of emotional abuse. There's terrorizing, spurning, and other kinds. But the one that I think is maybe most important in what we're talking about is something called exploiting. And exploiting is when you sort of live your life through a kid. You live your religion through a kid. And so these are some examples. I'm not going to say that the children that we're looking at here are necessarily being emotionally abused, but it just does give you an idea of how this form of emotional abuse can work. The first photo is of a little boy who's holding signs that have been given to him by his community called the Westboro Baptist Church. And they're the ones that protest at soldiers' funerals because they don't like the fact that people don't discriminate against gay people. So they have their children out on the street every day holding their signs. And you see his t-shirt, it says GodHatesFags.com. That's actually their website. If some of you are familiar with the movie Jesus Camp, it's an amazing documentary that shows what this one woman, like as she says, turns these little children into soldiers for Christ and has them all just taken up in, you know, this indoctrination that's filled with guilt and shame and abuse. The third image is of a little boy that was in a video that his parents posted on YouTube, and I'm going to play you a little bit of that. And now, I don't know this child. I don't know his parents. I am not going to stand here and say he's being emotionally abused. But what I noticed when I first watched this, the very first words that the mother says before she opens it, which is, "You're going to be so excited." Right. And it made me think of some of the people that I've interviewed who in their churches that they grew up in, oftentimes charismatic type churches, they have they will pick certain children who they think are going to do a job as being what I call little preachers. And now if this child were just to, you know, with his friends, act like he's a preacher and you know, he'll have his friends maybe sitting in the pews, the make-believe pews, and have fun with it, all the power to him. But what I see happening very often is they put a lot of pressure on the children. I've interviewed people who, as part of their duty as a child preacher, was to save people. I mean, go into their public school and they had to bring their teacher to Christ and stuff like that. And it was really emotionally traumatizing for them. So it's just something that I kind of peg, you know, I kind of just think when a mother says, you know, "You're going to be so excited about this." Well, really, maybe you should sit back and really see if he is excited, or maybe he's appearing excited because he wants to please you. About how many minutes do I have, would you say? Anybody know? 5 before Q&A? Okay. I'm going to then zip through a little bit here. I told you that I thought it was important to answer the question, when is a religious upbringing harmful for children? And so I sort of boil it down to these three characteristics: that a community would be adhering to a strict social hierarchy, that it's fear-based and socially separatist. One of the ways, or the main way, that children are actually harmed with this kind of strict governance is through the parents, where mothers and fathers often, or whoever's responsible for the kids, are turned into what I call, cult experts call middle manager parents. This is a painting of Abraham when he is right before he drops the knife, after he's told God that he's going to kill his son, Isaac. And I see Abraham in the Bible as the poster middle manager parent. I'm going to skip over this because it's a really hard sermon to listen to. Because of time, I want to be conscious of that, but also it's just a tough one to listen to, where this man is telling the audience of parents that they should basically be violent with their children if they appear to be gay, boys or girls. And he has a really harsh way of speaking, really authoritarian sounding, and you have the parents sort of nervously laughing at his quote jokes, and it's pretty awful. So, want to quickly talk about Cal Farley's Boys Ranch. This is a powerful, privately funded institution up outside of in the Panhandle, outside of Amarillo. It's been in operation since 1939, and it was started by Cal Farley, who was a wrestler. He wanted to start a residential program for boys that didn't have a proper home. Good on him. He had absolutely no training in anything related to child development. And when he really wanted to tighten the reins on the place, he got his wrestler friends to come in and be dorm parents and teachers and have total control over the children. Some of these children came from very abusive households. And instead of providing them with a safe, comfort-filled environment, they traumatized them. They didn't do this to all the boys. They kind of separated them into the ones that would be in the abusive dorms versus the non-abusive dorms. So you'll talk to people who were alumni who just can't believe anyone would say anything terrible about the place. Well, we have a closed Facebook group that has over 60 people in it. And this has only been in the last few weeks that these men have joined the group, all because it became big news when The Guardian came out with a story on December 16th. And that was the first time in the 80 years this place has been in operation that the public learned about what had taken place there. And these are not abuses that took place just a long, long time ago. In the group who were there in the 60s, we have members in the group who were there all the way up through the 90s. And one guy left in 2000. He said they were still beating children. So, we're still, my nonprofit is still advocating for the survivors of Cal Farley's Boys Ranch. We hope that they are going to now do something for those survivors. But at this point, all that's happened is the secret now is out. So, what can we do, to help stop this? How can we protect more kids? The first thing I like to tell people is, if you're getting into a conversation with someone who's religious and you want them to understand some of these issues, don't go down the theology path. This isn't about your beliefs shitty and mine's great. If you get into that, you start judging each other based on your belief systems, you're just not going to get anywhere. You have to find some kind of common goal where everybody cares about protecting children from abuse and neglect. And if you can kind of get on that common ground, oftentimes you can actually work with people of faith and help them understand the issues. And we need those people to be allies. Legislation really needs to be improved. Part of the reason why so many children died the way that one girl did in Idaho is because that state has religious exemptions that basically allow parents to neglect their children medically and not pay any price. As long as it was done for religious reasons, they can allow their children to get disabled, die from treatable illnesses, and not spend a day in prison. Supporting middle manager parents is important. If you know someone who's sort of ready to peel away from an authoritarian type religious environment, my book has a list of questions that you can ask people who are in that kind of situation. Questions like, does my pastor tell me how to raise my kids? Things like that. It's really important for them to understand that there are beneficial and welcoming, nurturing religious organizations out there, and that give autonomy to parents and not tell them how to raise their kids. And then we also work with religious organizations. We have a curriculum that we offer them. It's a discussion series that helps them understand some of these issues. So both religious folks as well as professionals, and child protection is really important. So this is information on who we are. And I think we have a little bit of time for questions. So why don't, if anyone wants to share anything or ask a question, feel free. I'm going to let you all cut us off at that point.
Have you heard of the film Kidnapped for Christ?
I have heard the film Kidnapped for Christ. Yes, I have. It's supposed to be excellent, and I've seen a trailer for it, and it looks really good.
Yeah, it seemed like the first 20 minutes. It talks about a camp that supposedly now closed. That was in the Dominican Republic called Escuela Caribe, where very wealthy Christian parents could send their homes for behavior modification. Lots of
Once you have kids in an institution where they're isolated from their parents, especially if they're in another country, they're like sitting ducks. And so we've seen a lot of problems in missionary schools in Africa and places like that that are overseen by American religious organizations, and there have been huge problems there. Yeah.
Do you find that people are shocked when you talk, and I don't want to put the onus on the entire Amish community, but have you ever found like people have this idyllic image of the Amish, and there's rampant child abuse in Texas. Not so much with the Hasidic Jews in New York, but I know most New Yorkers are kind of aware on the surface that the Hasidic Jews, that community is not good for children. Do you have problems explaining to people?
Yeah, for those listening, you can't hear the question. The question has to do with the Amish and Hasidic Jews. Both groups, highly authoritarian. They both strict hierarchy, fear-based. Not to say there's not love happening too, but the dogma that people adhere to, as well as the rules set in their cultures, lead people to be quite fearful. And thirdly, very socially separatist. The Amish are pretty geographically isolated as well. In the middle of an urban environment, there are going to be problems if you're not going to allow people in the group exposure to the outside world. And it's very difficult then, say, for authorities like CPS to even know when problems are happening. And yes, you're right. The people think of the Amish and Hasidic Jewish communities as being peaceful and loving and that kind of thing. I'm not saying that there are children that have come out of those communities whole and happy and wonderful, but there are extreme problems. Some of the worst abuses I think I've ever interviewed anybody about were people who came from Amish communities. And there's even one story that I'm going to just like live with for the rest of my life. It was so devastating, and it's in the book, but and I'm not just talking about physical abuse. There was one woman I interviewed who grew up Amish, and this kind of encapsulates. I dedicate my book to children who were denied the right to question, and that really was resonating with this woman's story. She said when she was growing up that it wasn't at all common for children to be asked about what they thought or felt or that kind of a thing, and it just was certainly not expected you would say what you thought or how you felt about things as an individual. And I said, well, what would happen if you had when you were a little kid? I mean, if you were to just utter how you felt about something as a child, what do you think would have happened? And she said, I don't think I ever had an opinion. I mean, how abusive is that? To have such an oppressive culture that children aren't even aware of their own individuality. So the emotional issues are really are really important to look at. Right?
We read about most egregious offenses. That's what we see in the, and that gives everyone else an out. Oh, that's not, you know, like I'm a mainstream Methodist or Presbyterian priest. Oh, that's not us. We love our children. But do you tell your children that if they don't believe what you believe, they're going to burn in hell for all eternity? Isn't that indeed emotional abuse?
Yeah, I think it's a real shame that when there is a real high profile, that it almost gets licensed to a lot of people of faith to say, well, those are the culty people who do that, or the extremist people, or the really, you know, they're just really bad apples, you know, and they're mentally ill. You know. It all contribute to abuse of a child. They can't all be mentally ill, but the more subtle kinds of abuses you're talking about go on all the time, every day, and they really, really get overlooked. So that's why it's important to understand the religious authoritarian aspect, because it comes in different degrees. Thanks again for hearing me on this. I really, really appreciate it.